Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The autumn wind carried whispers of change through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, a small frontier town nestled between unforgiving mountains and endless prairie. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die, where the railroad had promised prosperity but delivered only transient men and the establishments that catered to their darkest needs. Clara had stopped counting the days long ago. Time moved differently within the walls of Madame Beaumont's establishment, where candlelight replaced sunlight and the sound of a piano playing the same tired melodies drowned out the silence of her own thoughts. She had arrived 18 months earlier, a 17-year-old orphan from Missouri who had answered an advertisement for a seamstress position in the growing West. The advertisement had been a lie, and by the time she understood the truth of her situation, escape seemed as impossible as touching the stars. Tonight, something had broken inside her. Perhaps it was the way the newest arrival, a girl barely 16 with frightened doe eyes, had looked at Clara with such desperate hope, as if Clara might somehow save her from what was coming. Perhaps it was the realization that she had become numb to her own suffering, that she no longer recognized the girl she had once been. Or perhaps it was simply that the human spirit, no matter how battered, eventually finds a moment when it refuses to surrender completely. The window in her small room had been painted shut years ago, but months of patient work with a stolen butter knife had loosened the frame enough that it could be forced open with sufficient determination. Clara had hidden away a simple cotton dress, stolen piece by piece from the laundry, and a pair of worn boots that had belonged to a girl who had died of consumption 3 months prior. These meager possessions represented her entire plan for freedom. She waited until the house fell into its deepest sleep, that quiet hour between the departure of the last customer and the first gray light of dawn. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the window, the cold October air striking her face like a blessing. She had no money, no destination, no idea what awaited her beyond these walls. She only knew that she would rather die free than continue existing as a ghost. The drop from the second-floor window was farther than she had anticipated, and she landed badly, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sharp crack of pain. She bit down on her lip to stifle her cry, tasting blood, and forced herself to her feet. Behind her, the brothel stood silent and dark, a sleeping monster that would wake hungry for her return. Madame Beaumont was not known for her mercy toward those who tried to escape, and the sheriff was well compensated to return any wayward merchandise. Clara ran. She ran despite the fire in her ankle, despite the tears streaming down her face, despite the voice in her head that whispered she was foolish to hope. She ran through the back alleys of Silver Creek, past the general store and the blacksmith's shop, past the church that had never once offered her salvation. She ran until the buildings gave way to open land, and the town became nothing but a cluster of lights behind her. The cold was more brutal than she had imagined. Her thin dress offered no protection against the wind that swept across the prairie, and within an hour, her teeth were chattering so violently she feared they might shatter. Her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and each step sent bolts of agony through her entire body. She had no food, no water, no shelter. Freedom, she realized with growing despair, might simply be another word for a slower death. She collapsed beside a rocky outcropping as the first pale light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. The tears came freely now, hot against her frozen cheeks, carrying with them all the grief and shame and hopelessness she had kept locked away for 18 impossible months. She wept for the girl she had been, for the future that had been stolen from her, for the mother who had died too soon, and the father who had followed shortly after, leaving her alone in a world that seemed designed to crush the vulnerable. This was how Elijah Thorne found her. He had been riding since before dawn, moving a small herd of cattle toward winter pastures when he spotted the flash of pale fabric against the brown grass. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, and he approached cautiously, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. What he found instead stopped his heart. She was curled into herself, shaking with cold and sobs, her dark hair tangled and wild around a face that was beautiful, despite its tear-stained devastation. She wore nothing but a thin dress, entirely inadequate for the season, and one of her feet was bare, the boot apparently lost somewhere in her flight. Even before she lifted her head, and he saw the fear in her eyes, he understood something terrible had happened to this woman. Elijah dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He had spent his life around creatures who had been hurt by humans, horses beaten by cruel masters, dogs abandoned on the roadside, and he knew that trust could not be demanded, only earned. He kept his distance, raising his hands to show they were empty. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rocks, her eyes wild with panic. She had learned that men were dangerous, that kindness was merely a mask worn to disarm the unwary. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body had nothing left to give. Elijah remained still, giving her time to study him. He was not a handsome man by conventional standards, his face weathered by 35 years of sun and wind, his nose slightly crooked from a long-ago break. But his eyes were kind, a warm brown that reminded Clara of the chocolate her mother used to melt for special occasions, and there was a gentleness in his expression that she had not seen in a man's face for longer than she could remember. He spoke softly, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used to calm frightened horses. He told her his name, told her he had a ranch about 10 miles north, told her he meant her no harm. He said he was going to remove his coat now and set it on the ground between them, and she could take it if she wanted or leave it if she preferred, but he could not in good conscience ride away and leave her to freeze. True to his word, he shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat and placed it carefully on the grass, then retreated several steps. The coat was still warm from his body, and Clara could smell leather and wood smoke and something clean and honest that made her throat ache with unexpected longing. She watched him for a long moment, searching for the trap, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. But he simply stood there, patient as stone, his own body now exposed to the bitter wind. Slowly, fighting every lesson that survival had taught her, Clara reached for the coat. It was enormous on her, swallowing her small frame, but the warmth was so immediate and so profound that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. She pulled it tight around herself, burying her face in the collar, and something that had been frozen inside her began, tentatively, to thaw. Elijah asked if he could approach, and she found herself nodding, though she did not entirely understand why. He knelt beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, and examined her ankle with hands that were rough with calluses but impossibly gentle. He told her it was badly sprained, possibly broken, and that she needed proper care. He said he had a sister who lived on the ranch with him, a widow who had returned home after her husband died in a mining accident, and that Clara would be safe there, that no one would hurt her or force her to do anything she did not wish to do. She asked him why. Why would he help her, a stranger he had found shivering by the roadside, a woman who could offer him nothing in return? The question seemed to puzzle him, as if the answer were so obvious it barely required articulation. Because it was the right thing to do, he said. Because a man who could ride past suffering without offering aid was not a man worth being. He asked where she had come from, and she told him. She told him everything, the words pouring out of her like water from a broken dam, the advertisement, and the journey west, and the terrible moment when she had understood what Madame Beaumont truly intended. She told him about the locked doors and the painted windows, and the men who came in the night smelling of whiskey and entitlement. She told him about the girls who had given up hope and the ones who had died trying to escape. She expected disgust, expected him to withdraw his coat and his kindness, to look at her the way she had learned to look at herself. Instead, he looked at her with something that might have been sorrow or anger or both. He told her that none of what had happened was her fault, that the shame belonged entirely to those who had caged her and profited from her suffering. He told her she was brave, braver than she knew, to have run despite the fear, to have chosen death over continued captivity. And then he made her a promise. He promised her freedom, not as a gift to be granted by his generosity, but as a right that had always belonged to her and had merely been temporarily stolen. He promised that if she came with him, she would be free to leave whenever she chose, that no door in his home would ever be locked against her, that she would be given work if she wanted it, and rest if she needed it, and time, as much time as necessary, to heal. He promised that if the people from the brothel came looking for her, they would find only the barrel of his rifle and the determination of a man who had fought in too many wars to be frightened by painted women and corrupt lawmen. Clara studied his face as he spoke, searching for deception and finding none. She had learned to read men in the worst of circumstances, to identify danger in the set of a jaw or the flicker of an eye. What she read in Elijah Thorne was simply truth, plain and unadorned, spoken by a man who understood that promises were sacred things, not to be offered lightly or broken easily. She let him lift her onto his horse, let him walk beside her leading the animal by its reins, let him carry her into the small but sturdy ranch house where his sister Rachel waited with questions that died on her lips when she saw Clara's condition. Rachel asked no questions that day, offered only a warm bath and clean clothes and a bed with quilts that smelled of lavender and sunshine. She treated Clara's ankle with the competence of a woman who had tended many injuries, and she sat beside her until she fell into the first peaceful sleep she had known in 18 months. The winter that followed was a time of slow and painful healing. Clara's body recovered quickly enough, her ankle mending within weeks, the bruises fading to memories. Her spirit required more delicate care. There were nights when she woke screaming from dreams she could not escape, days when she could not bear to be in the same room as Elijah, despite his unfail. Gentleness. Rachel understood these moments without needing explanation, and she taught Clara the art of patience with oneself, the understanding that wounds of the soul do not heal on command. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and Clara found herself beginning to believe in the possibility of a future. She had learned to cook and to garden, to mend fences and tend cattle. She had discovered that she had a gift with the horses, a natural affinity that Elijah praised with quiet pride. She had learned to laugh again, first tentatively and then with increasing freedom, and she had learned that not all men were monsters, that some carried within them a capacity for kindness that asked nothing in return. By summer, she had fallen in love with him. She had not intended to, had not believed herself capable of such feelings after everything she had endured. But love does not wait for permission nor convenience. And she found herself watching for his return each evening, found her heart lifting at the sound of his voice, found herself imagining a life that extended beyond mere survival. She told him on a warm July evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold and the wildflowers swayed in the gentle breeze. She told him she loved him, and that she understood if he could not feel the same, if her past made her unsuitable for a respectable man's affection. She told him she would understand, would accept whatever friendship he could offer, would never ask for more than he wished to give. He was quiet for a long moment, and she felt her heart beginning to break with familiar resignation. But then he turned to her, and his eyes were bright with emotion, and he told her that he had loved her since that October morning when he had found her shivering by the roadside. He told her that her past did not diminish her, that she was the bravest and most beautiful woman he had ever known, and that if she would consent to be his wife, he would spend every remaining day of his life trying to be worthy of her. They were married in September in the small church in Silver Creek, with Rachel as their witness and the autumn wind carrying promises of new beginnings. Madame Beaumont had been arrested 6 months earlier, her establishment shut down by federal marshals investigating trafficking across state lines. The girls who had been trapped there were scattered now, some returned to families, others making their way as best they could in a world that offered few kindnesses to women with their history. Clara thought of them often, prayed for them in a church she had once believed had abandoned her. She and Elijah took in 2 of the girls over the following years, offering them the same patient healing that had been offered to her. The ranch became known as a place of refuge, a haven for those who had nowhere else to turn, and Clara found purpose in paying forward the grace she had received. She never forgot the morning Elijah had wrapped her in his coat and promised her freedom. It remained the pivot point of her existence, the moment when her story had transformed from tragedy to redemption. And every October, when the wind blew cold across the prairie and the leaves turned golden crimson, she would take out that old sheepskin coat, still carrying the faint scent of leather and smoke, and she would remember the man who had seen her humanity when she had forgotten it herself. Freedom, she had learned, was not merely the absence of chains. It was the presence of love, the dignity of choice, the courage to believe that even the most broken things could be made whole. It was a cowboy's coat on a cold morning and a promise spoken without expectation of reward. It was the simple, revolutionary truth that every person deserved compassion and that sometimes salvation came not from heaven, but from the kind hearts of ordinary people who refused to look away from suffering.